So good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm the Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and Director of our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of the University and the Center, I'm delighted to welcome you to our dialogue on proselytism and development in pluralistic societies. This is the latest in a series of day-long conversations on critical issues organized by our Religious Freedom Project under the leadership of Tom Farr and Tim Shah. Right at the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the RFP's leading partners, the Templeton Foundation and the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, and thank them for their support in helping to make today's event possible. As many of you know, this semester, Georgetown launched the Global Futures Initiative, a university-wide effort to engage critical global issues through a series of high-level events. Our focus this semester, in collaboration with the World Bank, is the global future of development. Now, today's dialogue will shed light on an important, contested, and I think you'll agree, poorly understood dimension of global development, its intersection with religion, with religious freedom, and with proselytism in particular. Now, we know that, on the one hand, faith-inspired groups committed to spreading their message make very many positive contributions to economic and social development around the world. But we also know that their presence can sometimes provoke hostility and generate conflict that undermines the pursuit of development goals. How are these groups, how are the societies they're engaging, how are governments and international organizations navigating these tensions? How have they navigated these tensions in the past? How are they doing so today? How should they do so into the future? Those are some of the key issues we'll be exploring today. Before I turn things over to my colleague, Tom Farr, to share some more background on the topic and today's agenda, I want to thank him and Tim and the staff of the Religious Freedom Project for putting together such an excellent program. I also want to acknowledge another center colleague, Catherine Marshall, an expert in global development, for her help in putting together today's program. You'll be hearing from Catherine later in two parts of our program. Today's event, which brings together colleagues from across the center, from across the university, experts from around the country with global experience and perspectives, really exemplifies, I think, what we're about at the Berkley Center and the RFP, the exploration of complex issues at the intersection of religion, peace, and world affairs from multiple perspectives. And I think you'll agree that this is very timely work. So thanks again for being here this morning, and please join me in welcoming Tom Farr.
Thank you, Tom. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you to, it's not exactly a beautiful day, but it could be worse. Thank you for joining us for this important and, I think, timely discussion of religious freedom, proselytism, and development. We'll begin shortly with our first two panels, the first of which I will moderate, followed by an exciting lunchtime keynote conversation with Ruth Messinger and Pastor Rick Warren, who is already here with us this morning. Many of you have greeted him. And then a concluding panel after lunch. Lunch is very important. It'll be here, so we're delighted you're here this early in the morning. Before we begin, I'd like to just say a few words about the Religious Freedom Project, which I have the honor of directing, as Tom mentioned, and which is the host of this conference. The RFP, as we call it, is located at Georgetown's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And last year, as Tom mentioned, we welcomed to our project a new strategic partner. The Templeton Foundation has been our partner since the beginning. In 2011, we welcomed a new partner in Baylor University and its Institute for Studies of Religion. This means, among other things, that two great faith-based institutions, namely Georgetown, the oldest Catholic university in the United States, and Baylor University, the largest Protestant research institution in the world, are working together on issues of religious freedom. And I am very, very proud of that and delighted that you're here today to join us in that as well as in our discussion. The Religious Freedom Project is the world's only university-based center for the study of religious freedom. Our goal is to research and disseminate knowledge about religious freedom. What is it? What's it mean? Why is it important for every human being, whether they're religious or not, and for every society? We believe religious freedom is important for international justice, peace, and stability. We define it in a very broad and capacious sense. We think it's the right of every person to believe or not, and if one believes, to worship, and if one believes, to act on the basis of religious belief in the public life of his or her society, both as an individual and as a member of a religious community. Now, that being the case, religious freedom, as we understand it, is not merely a private right to worship. It is that, but it also entails the right to engage in civil society, in business, in politics, on the basis of one's religious beliefs, and to do so in full equality with others who have no religious belief. We believe religious liberty is not a mere claim of privilege by religious people. Rather, it's a pillar of stable democracy, of economic development and societal flourishing. Unfortunately, notwithstanding its importance, for which I think there's a great deal of empirical evidence, religious freedom is clearly in crisis around the world. There is a global crisis of religious freedom. According to a series of reports, one just out last week by the Pew Research Center, 77% of the world's population, 77% of the world's population lives in countries where religious freedom is severely restricted. That's 3 out of 4 people in the world. Outside the West, as you know, those restrictions are often characterized by violent persecution of religious minorities. Inside the West, while violent persecution is not the norm, and please God never will be, the Pew reports show some troubling things, that government restrictions of and social hostilities toward religion have been rising in recent years. Europe is witnessing a profoundly troubling phenomenon, a rise in anti-Semitism. The United States is showing growing social hostilities toward religion and religious people. Our goal here at the Religious Freedom Project is to raise the profile of this issue, both here and abroad. We want to change the conversation among people who can do something about this global crisis, but who we believe aren't paying sufficient attention to it. That is, government officials, the media, the academy, and the business world. We do our work through a team of international scholars, some of whom are here today, some of whom you will hear from, through books and articles, workshops, consultations with governments, both private and public addresses, congressional testimony, media appearances, conferences such as this one here and abroad, and a vigorous web presence, including a blog. In all of these activities, we seek to engage not only the religious groups, but secular society in general. In particular, the skeptics of religion. In a very real sense, ours is an attempt to conduct a conversation about religious freedom with everyone, including and especially those who don't share our premises about the importance of religion and religious freedom. In that respect, let me mention briefly our blog. If you don't know about it, I want you to know about it. It's called Cornerstone, a conversation on religious freedom and its social implications. All voices on these issues are displayed in Cornerstone. To me, it's astounding that there is, as far as we know, no other blog in the world that focuses exclusively on international religious freedom. So we invite you to look it up. Read Cornerstone. Let us know what you think of it, and if you'd like to write for it, drop us a line. We'd love to have you involved. Okay, let's now get to our conference. I'll invite our first panel up in just a moment, but let me just frame the general conference a little bit. Today we're going to, as Tom said, zero in on a particularly important and particularly controversial aspect of religious freedom. To what extent, there are many ways to frame this, but let me frame it this way. To what extent does religious freedom include a moral or legal right to proselytize, that is, to share one's beliefs with others in hopes of persuading them to accept those beliefs? And that right, how does it impact, to the extent that there is a legal or moral right to proselytize, how does it impact development in countries around the world and humanitarian work? For many people, including most Christians and many Muslims, religion represents an objective and universal truth, one that comprehends the temporal good and the eternal destiny of every person. So for those who believe that, and that they have access to that reality and to that truth, the desire to offer it to others, I would argue, is both natural and rational. After all, if the claims of Islam are true, shouldn't we all be Muslims? If the claims of Christianity are true, shouldn't we all seek to be Christian? That, as it were, is a philosophical rationale for proselytism. On the other hand, and there's a big other hand, how does this religious imperative and any moral or legal right that is attached to it affect issues of development and humanitarian assistance in those countries where proselytism takes place? Sometimes, as we all know, proselytism has been socially disruptive and even rapacious, undermining the structures of families and communities. Is there a way to balance a right and an obligation, as seen by Christians and Muslims and others, by a right to provide peaceful witness to their own beliefs, with another right, and that is to development, to defend minority religious communities against proselytism? How do you talk about this? How do you balance these issues? Trained as an American diplomat as I am, I balance every issue. On the one hand and on the other hand. Sometimes, however, it's not that simple, and I suspect we're going to find that out today. These are important issues for our country and for the world, so let's get started. I'm going to ask our first panel to come up, and I will frame that panel and introduce them to you. So, lady and gentlemen, come on up to the stage. Please, thank you. Okay. I know we're all wired. Are we, so to speak, are we being heard? Can you hear me in the back? Very good. This panel, as you can see from your program, is entitled, I don't have the title in front of me, The Historical Context for Proselytism, Development, and Humanitarian Issues. And so before I introduce this wonderful group of people, let me provide a little bit of context for this panel. We want to set the stage for this day-long discussion on proselytism and development and humanitarian issues. And we want to begin by discussing a little bit about what proselytism is, and we have some of the world's greatest experts on this sitting here to my left, putting it into its historical context and exploring some of its effects on development and humanitarianism. Proselytism is as old as religion itself, which means it's as old as humanity itself. Proselytizers have existed throughout history, across the world's religions, and across the world's regions. Doesn't mean that every religion is a proselytizing religion, but as I said before, if you believe you have some universal access to some universal truth, it's rational to want to know other people to know about it. So here's some of the questions we want to engage in this panel. Among all the elements of religious freedom, given that this is one of the most controversial, for many, proselytism is a bad word. Does it warrant this bad press? Moreover, today it's often assumed to be mainly Christian and mainly negative in its impact on societies. How true is that assumption, both of those assumptions? To what extent has Christian proselytism and other proselytism had a negative impact on development and on humanitarian action? And what has that impact been? Has there been in the past, is there today any upside to proselytism? For example, in terms of economic or political development. What about humanitarian work by religious and secular actors? If we consider humanitarian work a form of development, which we do, how does proselytism fit into that? Is there such a thing as non-religious or secular proselytism? And if so, to what extent should we be taking that into account as we discuss this issue? All right, let's get started. You have the bios of the speakers. I'm going to introduce them very briefly and skip most of the institutional affiliations, but I do want to say something and let you know something about the marvelous expertise represented on this panel. Robert Woodbury, down at the very end of the panel, is an associate scholar with the Religious Freedom Project, among the other things that you see in his bio. Professor Woodbury is a sociologist specializing in the impact on religion on political development and economic change. For well over a decade, he has analyzed the long-term social, political, and economic impact of Protestant missionary activity in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This research resulted in a groundbreaking and seminal article entitled "The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy," published in the flagship journal of political science, the American Political Science Review, in May 2012. It won the American Political Science Association's 2013 Lubert Best Article Award, given for the best article in the field of comparative politics, published in the previous 2 years. Bob, we're delighted to have you. Michael Barnett of George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs is currently spending a year at the Transatlantic Academy. I had an honor to come and speak to his group a few months ago. This group is working, and Michael is working on a project on religion and the liberal international order. Professor Barnett has written extensively on international relations theory, global governance, humanitarian action, and the Middle East, which is very much at the center of what we talk about in any discussion of religious liberty. He's the author of numerous books, including, perhaps, there are many relevant to our topic today, but The Empire of Humanity, A History of Humanitarianism. And he'll be helping us understand the effects of proselytism on humanitarianism. And last, but by no means least, my dear friend and colleague, Rebecca Samuel Shaw, also an associate scholar with the Religious Freedom Project at the Berkley Center. Rebecca heads a research initiative on religion, entrepreneurship, and economic development in the modern world entitled, get this title now, I think this is in there, but I wanted to repeat it. This is one of the best. Great, I don't know who thought this up, Becky, but
the Puritans, the 17th century.
the Puritans, she said the Puritans in the 17th. Listen to this. Holy Avarice, Religion and the Re-Enchantment of Modern Capitalism, which is funded by the Religion and Innovation in Human Affairs program of the Historical Society in Boston. Rebecca also leads a research project on the effects of tithing and thrift on the enterprising poor in Bangalore, India, funded by the John Templeton Foundation, which is represented here today. In 2011, she conducted groundbreaking research on the role of Pentecostalism among Dalit women in India. So welcome to you all. Let's get started. Bob Woodbury, let's begin with you. You've done, as I've already said, extensive work on the history of proselytism, especially Protestant Christianity, but also in other religious and, I believe, in other secular traditions. So would you kick us off by giving us your understanding of what proselytism is and how widespread it's been across history up till today? And if you would, say something, as I'm sure you will, about its role in development.
I think proselytism is amazingly widespread. I think it's easier to think of it as trying to convince people to change how they think or how they act or what their identity is, which is, I think, something that everyone does. We do it when we teach in university, we try and change how people think, etc. So it's trying to change how people think or behave or their identity in a religious sphere, which everyone does. And I can show historically that all religious traditions have done it, and there's been important religious change over time. What varies is not whether people try and change how people think or behave or what their identities are. What varies is how it's done, and to what extent organizations are built up for spreading it on a longer scale without having either a conquering army or business elites that spread it. And so I think it's easier to think of it in terms of you have forced conversion, you have incentivized conversion, you have forced exposure, and you have incentivized exposure. And there are different levels of being problematic. But I can show you that all the major world religious traditions have used all of those techniques to change people's religious beliefs or practice. So if you think of incentivized conversion, if you have Google, if you use Google, you're getting a free service. In exchange for that free service, they put ads. And so you could do that in terms of religious groups who provide a free service, and in exchange for that, they expose you to their message. You have forced exposure. You could see that like state education. You're required to go to school. In that school, there are textbooks. Those textbooks have content. You are exposed to certain ideas. You're exposed to certain value systems within that education. And then you get into areas that are more problematic in terms of forced, incentivized conversion. We're saying, if you make this religious change, you will get this direct benefit. That becomes more problematic, at least from my standpoint. And then you have forced conversion, which I think is the most problematic one.
Sorry. So forced conversion,
Yeah.
bad. I think we all agree. On the other end of the spectrum, incentivized. What's the other
Incentivized exposure?
exposure? That's the Google.
Yeah, so like if you have
Okay.
Google, if you use Google, they'll put ads on you.
Right.
It doesn't mean you have to buy that product. It just
You can
means you're
turn off
exposed
the-
to that
you can turn
product
off
because
the
you
lever.
use this free service.
Got it. And then you have in the interim, just one more time, the other two models. in the-
Forced exposure, where
Forced
you're required to do something, and then in that you're exposed to
Okay.
a thing,
Okay.
which is a little bit more problematic, but we do it every time we force someone to read something for our class, or
Okay.
you have state education.
Yeah, I practice.
I mean,
that
teachers,
frequently.
no, professors, like we're doing forced exposure. People listen to our lectures, people read the things that we make them read, and we give them an exam on it.
Right.
So we're forcing them to be exposed to that type of thing.
Yeah. My students' behavior doesn't change, unfortunately.
Right, because it's not forced change,
Okay.
which is more problematic.
All right. All right, got it. So please, no, continue.
And then there's incentivized conversion, which I think is problematic, where there's some type of quid pro quo. If you make this change, then you will receive this benefit, or you will not receive this punishment.
Okay.
But that is also quite common in history among a lot of different religious traditions. And I can show it to you historically. As well as forced conversion is quite common.
All right.
Historically.
So can you say a little bit about the effects of these various models on development historically?
Okay, I haven't. The effect of having free competition between religious groups you can show empirically, has a lot of effects on how society is, most of which I think are positive. Certainly the impact of Protestant and Catholic missionaries on most things have been, particularly Protestant missionaries, have shaped things like increasing the level of education, whether people use printed material or not, the level of voluntary associations, the level of economic development, life expectancy, infant mortality, political democracy, et cetera. There's a positive relationship between Protestant missions and all of those outcomes, which are very strong and robust. So it's partially through the competition, though, that happens between religious groups when they have to compete as opposed to impose.
Now, within Christianity, you made a distinction, and I know you do this a little bit in your work, particularly in the article that I mentioned,
Right.
which I use in my classes, by the way. Thank you for writing that article. I think it's very provocative, and it really rivets the students on something that they hadn't really thought of in these terms. I mean, most of them are sort of, it's built in proselytism bad.
Right.
It's colonialism. It's, it has negative effects. It takes advantages of people. Right. I mean, can you respond to, why is this perception there? And is there some truth to it?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think, well, there's multiple things. Some of the academics tend to be sort of secular, so they don't tend to like religion, certainly not conversionary religion.
Present company accepted.
There's a reaction in terms of nationalism. So you have anti-colonial movements, which then often sort of link to anti-missionary movements. So you have a reaction to what happened in terms of European colonization.
Right. So in China, for example, in the 19th century, the presence of mainly Protestant missionaries, I assume, at that point. In China?
No, it was both Protestant and Catholic.
At the time? Okay.
Yeah.
It triggered a real response by the Chinese government.
Right. I mean, existing elites tend to not want competition and have violently suppressed it both in Europe and in other countries. So if you look at, for example, in England, you get Quakers, you get Baptists and other things. They're violently suppressed because you have a dominant Anglican religion that everyone wants, well, not everyone, that the government and religious elites want people to stay part of. And they make the argument that it will lead to instability and violence if these other groups are allowed to proselytize. And then they use a lot of violence to try and suppress them. We get a lot of the rights that we consider to be valuable through this competition. So, for example, the idea of the independence of the jury was partially decided through a case about proselytism. You had William Penn and William Meade, who were two Quakers who were doing street evangelism. It was made, a law was passed that trying to evangelize people was disturbing the peace. So they were arrested and put on trial for disturbing the peace. And the jury found them not guilty because they said they hadn't been doing anything that was violent or anything that was disturbing the peace. They were just trying to convert people. The judge put them in prison and fined them for not filing a court of the law and refused to give them food or water or chamber pots for the first several days. An appeal was put in the court, and then the decision was made that judges could not punish jurors for finding not according to what the judge wanted. That's how we get the right of independence of juries. I can give you tons of examples of how this competition of elites trying to restrict conversion in Europe have led to rights that we think are really valuable. And a lot of the things we're embarrassed about in the past in terms of Europe is when the government or other religious elites have forced restrictions on other minorities and not allowed that. Now, in other contexts, we tend to put it totally in a different mechanism, but I don't see historically why it's any different.
Okay. We'll come back to this. Let's get Professor Barnett in here. Michael, as I said before, humanitarianism, as we are approaching this, is part of development. We think it's a critical issue where religious people, in particular religious groups, are concerned, but there's obviously a lot of non-religious humanitarian work being done out there, and you've done some of the most extensive work that's ever been done on the history of humanitarianism and humanitarian action in this regard. So, in your view, how common has it been for individuals and groups to include a proselytizing or conversionary motive in their humanitarian activities?
Historically, it's actually dissipated over the centuries. That, you know, the way I've thought about humanitarianism, which is the attempt to relieve the suffering of distant strangers, is something that in many ways is as old as human history. Compassion is not something that's recent or modern. It's something that as we know, has always existed. But contemporary humanitarianism, in which there's been sustained organized attempts to relieve suffering, is really something more of a modern invention, beginning in the late 18th century, early 19th century.
Is this associated with the rise of Western democracies, or
It's not so much about democracy. It really is about a combination of religious change. It was and globalization. You had expanding markets that led people to be more aware, in which, as we saw in Britain and the early abolitionists, more aware that the sugar that they used to put in their tea was coming from slavery in the Caribbean islands,
right,
making them more aware then. I mean, in many ways, as my students do, the kind of apparel they buy and whether, in fact, it comes from unfair workshop conditions.
right.
So there was a variety of, and there was a broad kind of reformist mentality that begins to emerge, that we can actually improve humanity. It's not something that we have to be fatalistic about. We can actually make life better. And so all that begins to come together in the early 19th century. But the part that I want to really emphasize is that much of it was spearheaded by religious movements. So I don't know if I would go so far as to say no religion, no humanitarianism, but you can't write the history of humanitarianism without necessarily taking into account the tremendous role that various kinds of faith-based organizations played. And that includes not only from the beginnings of abolitionism, but throughout the 19th century in various kinds of justice movements. This begins to change, though, in the 20th century, where you see actually a decline, not so much in the number of religious organizations, but I would say because I think faith-based organizations, which is the term of art that we tend to use in humanitarian action, versus secular organizations, we still have lots and lots of faith-based organizations. In fact, they've grown over the last 20 years in terms of number. But in terms of what they do, in terms of proselytism, that has actually been restricted and self-restricted, self-imposed restrictions over the last century. And there are several reasons why, which I think are important that, as we think about the implications of proselytism in terms of promoting global justice. The first is just broadly secularization, that humanitarianism is part of the world, and we've seen a broader secularization of the world. And as a consequence, then, one of the impacts is not only an attempt to sort of restrict the religion to the private, and that includes various public activities like social reform movements, but it's also meant the growing role of the state. So one of the defining characteristics of humanitarianism over the last 20th century is it used to be private voluntary organizations, or the churches would put together most of the resources that were done for colonial relief. Now it's almost all going through very large non-governmental organizations, or more likely the state. And so that has actually reduced, and the state has actually oftentimes places very severe restrictions on the kinds of activities, proselytizing activities, that aid organizations can use.
Much of the funding for these large NGOs comes through the state.
Through the state, and even some of the largest faith-based organizations like Catholic Relief Services, the figures vary, but it's upwards of 70% at times. And then there are organizations that decide they want to actually reduce the leverage of the state over their activities, like the World Vision International, which I know there's someone here who can speak to the percentages, but my understanding is they always try to cap it at 30% so that they're not too unduly influenced by the state. So these things vary across faith-based organizations. The second reason, though, why it's declined is because the ethic of humanitarianism is to save lives in distress, which means that your number one goal is to get access. And the best way to get access, and this is actually learned through trial and error, the best way to get access is to present and be impartial, independent, and neutral. That the moment you're seen as having an alternative agenda or motive, then people will become suspicious of you. It's more difficult to get access, and you will find yourself not simply unable to get access, but when you get there, you may find yourself becoming an enemy combatant, where the aid worker now becomes not a deliverer of relief, but rather becomes an object of injury. And so for a variety of principled and very functional reasons, what you've seen then is that faith-based and secular organizations have all largely converged on the idea that humanitarianism really should be impartial, independent, and neutral. Now, one of the interesting things that's gone on is that we continue to see, of course, lots of humanitarian organizations that don't abide by these kinds of principles. And that includes not simply Christian organizations, but also Muslim organizations. The reports are that, as we've seen a growth of Islamic humanitarianism in various parts of the Islamic and non-Islamic world, it's very clear that, as Bob was saying, there's incentivizing going on. And so part of the conversation that's taken place between in humanitarianism, even among faith-based organizations, is coming to sort of an agreement about what the rules of the road are, what you can and cannot do. The last element that helps to explain why there's been a decline of proselytism is really about an ethic. And an ethic of what humanitarianism means. And humanitarianism, as I've suggested, is about relieving the suffering of distant strangers. But in many ways, it's tapping into what everyone believes is the best side of themselves. It is about compassion. And it's supposed to be a compassion without strings. And part of the fear, though, is that in a situation of tremendous adversity, as we find in conflict and natural disasters, where people are really at their most vulnerable and weak, the idea that you would come and say, well, I would love to give you the shelter you need over your family, or clean water, or food, or medicine, but it's going to come with a message. And that message, I don't mean to suggest it's only about religion, but it could also be about human rights and other kinds of secular movements. For many people, strikes them as vile, that this is ambulance chasing at its worst, that you basically are capitalizing on people when they're most vulnerable and are weakest, and as a consequence, really have no choice but to say, I accept the terms. And so it's no longer in the kind of generic way of incentivizing. This is the part that many people in the humanitarian field worry about. It's about power. That there's a relationship, it's not a dialogue of free exchange of ideas, but these free exchange of ideas are coming in the context of gross asymmetries of power. And so that means that those who are engaged in humanitarian action have to be very careful about the kinds of messages they feel like they need to deliver at that moment. So there's a lot of ways in which we distinguish between humanitarianism and development. And one of them may be that, and I just simply throw this out as a speculation or a point of conversation, is that maybe in the context of development assistance, it may be that proselytism in some form may be okay, although I think, again, that's a matter of debate. I think it's clear that within the humanitarian world, there's an agreement by a lot of faith and secular organizations that any kind of proselytism, whether it's religious or non-religious, is something that should be put off the table.
Okay, well, I want to hear from Bob on that in a minute. We'll go to Becky here, but before I go to Becky, do you have any sense that the issue of the motives of faith-based religious groups is in any sense at risk in this broad trend that you're seeing? In other words, is it possible? I think most people could agree that are faith-based groups that the conditionality, this is my word, is absolutely unethical and unreligious. There can't be this requirement, and that they are in fact doing something out of conviction that this is what they're supposed to be doing religiously. Is that motivation at all at risk, given the growth of government involvement, the growth of government funding, and the restrictions that go with it? In other words, there are a lot of people, I would think, that just wouldn't be out there if they didn't think they were doing something as a response to a religious organization. Motivation. Mm-hmm. Do you see that problem out there?
I think it's complicated, and the reason why is that I actually have a difficult time understanding why people are motivated to help others in need. And I don't want to say I don't want to suggest I find it odd, but rather the motives are complicated. I've got students that really are truly compassionate and want to save the world. I've also got students that want to pad their vita and make themselves look better as they hit the job market. I've talked to religious organizations in which people say they want to get a bit closer to heaven. And this is the way in which they take the ride. I've heard other people say that it's just simply about a private connection and a private conviction that's spiritual and personal, and that really has no other secondary gain. So I think the motives themselves for anybody who's engaged in humanitarian action is so mixed that it's difficult to find the single motive. If I could, though, one of the things that this has been a matter of debate in terms of the motives, just to give this is not simply a contemporary issue, this is actually a deeply historical issue. Back in, and maybe Bob can correct me or add if I've said something a little bit askew here, because I'm now dipping into history. But in the late 19th century, this was the debate among missionaries, was should you engage in proselytism, or should it be just simply enough to provide public health clinics and education and so forth that was designed to improve the situations of individuals, their material conditions, without necessarily having to save their souls? And there was a set of very interesting meetings that took place among world missionary leaders that tried to sort through this issue. And essentially they decided, I think for a combination of principles and pragmatics, that would probably be best if they simply reduced the amount of time they spent trying to deal with people's souls and spent more time just trying to deal with their intellectual abilities, their reason, and their physical health, that would be better. And I don't think, and I see those debates going on today, but I don't think that whether in fact the restriction on proselytism affects the motives or the willingness to partake in humanitarian action, I think is varied. But most of the organizations that I've studied have come to terms with the fact that their faith and what motivates them is not necessarily going to lead them to proselytism.
Okay, well, this is a perfect segue to India, and I wasn't going to start with Mother Teresa, Becky, but let me just note that she's been in the news. Of course, she died in, I guess, 1996, but she's been in the news recently on this very issue, whether or not she was a proselytizer. And, you know, I just wonder, she actually was asked that one time, you know, what are you doing? And she said, I'm doing God, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm doing God's work. I leave the conversion to others. But she probably had the impact, Becky, of converting more people to Christianity and to Roman Catholicism than anyone else of her time, with the possible exception of Pope John Paul II. So she was, in a sense, a proselytizer, if that means somebody whose work invites people to ask, why are you doing this? And it leads on from there. So with that as a background, let me just pose the question to you like that, and you can come around to Mother Teresa as you like. India, obviously, is one of the countries that has seen some of the fiercest controversy on religious proselytism and religious conversion. And it's very interesting because it involves Christians, Hindus, and Muslims. And you've done as much work and more than most people on this issue in India, both in history and in the present day. So talk to us a little bit about what's driving some of the tensions and the conflicts, and tell us a little bit about what's going on in this issue in India.
Well, certainly. Well, I mean, if anyone is in any doubt about the importance of this issue, then they should just look to the news in India, certainly in the last 2 or 3 months, but even in the last week, and they'll see how this issue of proselytism and development has come to a head, as it were. Well, there are two main reasons I'm going to say. There may be others, but I can think of 2 reasons why there is such a tension and a conflict surrounding proselytism in India, and conversion in particular as well. One is that the conversions in India that have drawn attention in the news as well, historically as well as recently, take place among the poorest of the poor in India. They are the ones that are converting quite heavily not just in the tribal areas. Historically, there have been problems with the Dhangs in Gujarat. These are tribals, we call them in India Adivasis, original people, who've been converting to Christianity, and that conversion continues. There are conversions in Orissa, in conversions in Madhya Pradesh, and historically, there have been conversions among Dalits and outcasts, and these are the people I work with in particular. And there's a fear, it seems to me, that these conversions are somehow induced, that the people are being, as to use Bob's term, sort of either forced or incentivized to convert, and that missionaries are preying on the vulnerability of the poor. And the second reason for there being such a conflict and tension surrounding conversions is because of the fear of the Hindu nationalist parties. That would be the right-wing Hindu national organization, the RSS, the Rashtra Swayam Sevak Sangh, or the VHP, who feel that in some ways that Islam and Christianity, these proselytizing religions, are taking away Hindu Hindus from their faith. They're preying on Hindus. In fact, the same chap, Mohan Bhagat, who made a comment about Mother Teresa a couple of weeks ago,
Tell us about that, would you, what he said?
Yeah, well, what he said was, it was interesting because it ties in with this whole idea that conversion and proselytization, I never get this right, actually encourages competition. And as an economist, I like competition. So what, in fact, he was doing was, he's the General Secretary of the RSS. He was at the opening of an orphanage for the poor. And it was interestingly named Shishu Bhavan or something, which is the name that a lot of the names of the missionaries of charity have for their orphanages. And he was at the inauguration.
Missionaries of Charity being Mother Teresa's organization.
And he was at the inauguration, and he said, this service will not be like the service provided by Mother Teresa. It will be service for service sake. What she did was with a view, and I'm paraphrasing, the service, something he said, it was Indian English, so I don't know, I can't really remember, it was something, the services rendered where, with a view to making them all Christian. And that was what he said, and of course, to be fair, the Indian press and many Indian scholars, politicians from all faiths have risen up and criticized Mr. Bhagat's statements. So that's what he said.
But he was suggesting this conditionality.
He was saying that, in fact, what happens is that missionaries, through their work, through Mother Teresa, Christian organizations, mission schools, and so forth, were in fact using these organizations as a means to prey on Hindus. But Mohan Bhagat said this last week. He actually said that, you know, a few months ago, he says, India needs to be a Hindu Rashtra. In fact, the RSS have a program that by 2020, they want to make India a Hindu country. And for that reason, Christians and Muslims are with their proselytizing, what they call proselytizing conversionary religions, preying on Hindus. I mean, historically, this is a historical panel, Tom, and well, there was an excellent historical study that many people may not know of, and it was a study that was one of the largest studies on Dalit Christianity. It was a survey of 3,800 households that was conducted in the 1930s by Bishop Wascom Pickett, and his study was funded by the organization that funded the Middletown studies here in America. It was a very rigorous social scientific study of converts. And it took place because there was this surge in mass conversions in India, and the missionaries were skeptical. And the study was born out of skepticism. So to say that missionaries are out there to inflate the numbers and have a sunny view of conversion is not entirely true, because the missionaries did not want to see these large numbers of converts, because they felt they were being converted for material needs, that they were, the term is sort of rice Christians. So Bishop Wascom Pickett and his associated conducted this study to identify what were the real reasons for conversion. Now, I'm not saying that some of the conversions took place for instrumental reasons. I'm sure there were, but the study showed that for the most part, converts converted for intrinsic spiritual reasons, and this is some of the findings that I find in my own research, and we can go into this, but
okay. Well, let's have a little bit of interplay here now. We've heard from all three of you, and Bob gave us a little bit of the history of conversionary Protestants and the humanitarian. I'm fascinated by the notion, and I'm sure it's empirically true, that the growth of secular humanitarian work and the growth of government management, let's call it that way, not control of humanitarian work, has had a major impact on it. And the subtext, Michael, of this kind of humanitarian proselytism, if you will, can be secular as well as religious. That's a theme we've gotten. And then, of course, the issue of the Dalits and whether or not what's going on in India, this interesting Hindu resistance, which one could associate with we see a little of this in Russia, don't we, with the notion of the Russian Orthodox Church as being Mother Russia. It is Russia. If you're Russian, you must be Russian Orthodox. If you're Indian, you must be Hindu. I mean, this is of course, poison for the notion of religious freedom, but it is a powerful force in the issue of proselytism and development and the way that these groups react to each other. So, Bob, could I get you just to respond to some of the things that you've heard here, particularly, the notion that it's just hard to see. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's hard sometimes to see the positive impact of conversionary Protestants around the world, and that you've made a case, but respond to what you've heard.
I don't think it's hard to see. I don't think people look. So there's lots of things which people pick anecdotes to, or they listen to other people who think like them and make an echo chamber and have all these things going on. So when we talk about unethical conversion or other things like that, I've never seen a survey where they actually looked at people and said, what happened to you? Did people offer you money for this? Or did they what? You just get religious leaders and political leaders who say like, oh, this happened, or they find some example and tell it over and over again, and then they put a label on it, which is something that's something for only other people. So it's their stuff, that's proselytism. Their stuff, that's unethical conversion. But what we do, that's good. We're just trying to convince people, whatever. But you get into all kinds of things that are involved incentivizing non-conversion and forcing non-conversion, which I don't think are any different from the reverse. Yeah. So if you make laws, for example, like they have in India, that if you convert, then you have to make a public thing, and then you can be exposed to all kinds of social persecution, and you get all these benefits if you are Hindu. And in fact, in this past week, the Supreme Court in India made a law that if you reconvert to Hinduism, then you get all the benefits that you couldn't get if you were a Christian or some other religious group that's not Hindu or Buddhist or Sikh. But if you reconvert, then you get all the benefits again of affirmative action. That is incentivized change. But it's institutional. And in fact, governments and militaries and majority populations are the people who can force. Minority groups that come in outside are not groups that can force easily, certainly not in this day and age. They can incentivize exposure, is what they do. They incentivize exposure. And so I'm against, well, personally, I would be against any type of force or any type of thing where you're incentivizing change. But you have to get in the issue of, like, we often get into sort of the purity police. Who gets to be the purity police that sort of monitors the motivation of other people and says, oh, that's not a good motivation, we're going to put you down? Because then we're assuming that they have pure motives, which I don't always trust. Sometimes it's better to have competition. So if you have, for example, on average, the people who convert to Buddhism and Hinduism in the United States, for example, are often groups that are been discriminated against by Christianity. So Muslims, blacks are more likely to convert to Islam, gays and lesbians are more likely to convert to Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. People who've been exploited are more likely to convert. That just happens all over. But if people are putting a requirement with aid or something, an easy way to do that is to have multiple options in terms of aid. And then if, like, I'm forcing you to do something because I'm this evil person in order to get this thing, if I have a free option right next door, I'll go to that. And then it'll totally undermine anything that I'm requiring people to do. Okay, but what about Michael's point that behind a lot of this really there is no real competition. There are these asymmetries of power, as he put it, and colonialism as a historical backdrop to this problem. How do you respond to that? Well, I think in every situation there are asymmetries of power. As a professor, I have more power than my students. I have to be aware of that. As a government, I often have more power than these religious groups. As a dominant religious community, I have more power than minority religious communities. There's power involved all over. It's not just with missionaries. It is everywhere, and we have to pay attention to that everywhere. But as long as we put it as something that, oh, just they have, then we don't learn from it. We think that's just their problem, and then we don't apply it to ourselves when we have power. And we need to be careful about that. We need to be careful to not make what other people do something different from what we do so that we don't learn from it.
Michael?
Yeah, there, I guess, two responses. As a political, part of it will be wearing my hat as a political scientist. Is that part of me, when I hear the word competition, having taken lots of economics courses, and they tell you what competition looks like in an economics textbook, and then you go, well, what does it look like in a real marketplace? And then they go, oh, well, there are all these regulations, and we have these problem of interest groups, and all of a sudden we have political power that actually restricts competition, makes it difficult for people to enter into markets and things like that. And then you go, oh, so that's really what competition means, is that competition is almost always restricted and is never perfect. And I think so when we talk about sort of the religious competition, there are, I think, been very few historical moments. Maybe the case, you know, the one I know, I guess, best would be 19th century United States, where there really did seem to be so much experimentation and competition that maybe it looks more like that religious marketplace of ideas. That's the first. The other is, and just to respond to Bob's, I mean, yes, I think that all social relationships are unequal. As someone who's been married for 23 years now, I'm deeply aware that equal also includes lots of asymmetries. And so I think that's understood. But to say that all asymmetries are equal, because we know that in some social relationships, those asymmetries are grossly unequal, and that in some of those relationships, one of those powers actually can in fact have enforcement power. Right. And in that prior colonial experience, it wasn't as if the missionaries came in unarmed. They had oftentimes the army right behind them, and everybody understood that. So there is almost always an element of power and gross asymmetries of power in many of these contexts. And so I do think we can think of greater and lesser, but even to understand, I think, the notion of, let's say, what's taking place right now in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the kind of competition that exists, without fully appreciating that colonial dimension in which this is not something that happened just a century ago. It's something that's understood contemporary as ongoing. I think is to fundamentally misread oftentimes the nature of that experience. And you don't have to take my word for it. There are a lot of surveys that have been done within the humanitarian sector that are an attempt to in fact, probe how it is that the recipients view those who are coming to deliver the aid. And what they're finding is that, not a surprise here, is that that colonial past still lingers very heavily over that present relationship.
And now this is often not, sometimes this has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with the country that is delivering aid, right? It might often be, it might be the United States, just to take a random example, delivering aid in sub-Saharan Africa and be perceived as an imperialist power without any religious groups being effectively the agents. Just talk a little about that.
No, that's, you know, and part of it, this is a hydra-headed kind of animal called humanitarianism, which there are lots of different actors that have lots of different relationships to one another. And I just sort of, to spin it a little bit, though, away from the Western Christianity, one of the central challenges right now within the humanitarian sector is that what you have now is the emergence of what are called new actors. And the new actors are not just simply religious actors, faith-based actors from the United States, but they're actually coming from Turkey. They're coming from the Gulf. These are private charities that are oftentimes associated with the royal family. They have a clear agenda when they are involved in humanitarian relief, whether it's in the Sudan or in Somalia or in Syria and in its environs. And this is itself raising the same kinds of issues that those in the West have been struggling with for a while. So these challenges are ongoing, And they're not just simply one of the West and the rest. I think as the examples from India point out, this is something that is very much a global phenomenon.
Becky, you want to?
Well, I just wanted to, well, thank you for your comments on competition. I wanted to say that my statement about competition was informed by not just the fact that Mohan Bhagat in making the statements about Mother Teresa was inaugurating a home for the poor, which historically the RSS and the VHB have not been involved, were not involved in humanitarian or development work. But we see that over the last, certainly in the last 30 to 40 years, and maybe intensively in the last 10 years, there has been a growth in the number of Hindu hospitals. For example, the state of Jharkhand has had one mission hospital, St. Luke's, which was the main mission hospital, the only hospital, and people from all over the village, the state would come to that hospital. Recently, I had to do a survey for a pharmaceutical company to ask them for BAYLO Medical College, who wanted to set up there, and they said, well, actually, there's not just St. Luke's now. There are about 8 to 10 hospitals, and of the 8 to 10 hospitals, a majority of those hospitals were set up by Hindu groups. So, in a sense, proselytization, conversion has actually spurred a competition for provision of healthcare services in this very, very poor state. So that's what I wanted to say. Mission schools are no longer the only schools now in India that provide top English education. If you come to my own state of Karnataka, which is home to Intel and Microsoft and Apple and all these, the Silicon Valley of South Asia, it's called, won't necessarily find only Bishop Cotton School or Baldwin's or Clarence School, mission schools. You have top secular as well as Hindu schools that provide excellent English education. And one more thing, Tom, if I have time to add to Bob's point about incentivized conversion. Of course, Bob very aptly mentioned the Apex Court in India. Now passed a law last week which said that now positive discrimination, compensatory discrimination is now available for people who reconvert. And in fact, this ties in with what I was saying about Hindu nationalism. India has, since the framing of the Constitution in the 1950s, struggled with, we have an Article 25, Section 1, which President Obama actually cited in his speech in India at Siri Fort at the end of January, which really rocked my country, because he had this American president come and talk about religious freedom. I don't think they were expecting this after he had chai with Narendra Modi in the garden and everything looked cozy, and then he brings religious freedom up. So it was very interesting.
Just make a side comment here. We have, as some of you know, an International Religious Freedom Act, which we've had for 16 years or so. And as a sometimes critic of the way that act has been implemented, one of the few things that has been done during the course of the last 16 years was to ban a man named Modi, who was at the time, I guess, the
Chief Minister of Gujarat.
Chief Minister of Gujarat, from the United States. He is now the Prime Minister or President of India?
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister of
parliamentary system.
And now, when he was elected, that was quickly dropped, although I never saw any official action about it. But he was banned because of his role in, or alleged role, in not saving, helping, sending the Hindu police to save particularly Muslim women who were being massacred by Hindu mobs in the state of Gujarat. He was the head of the police force in the, I'll never forget this, I think it was a Human Rights Watch report, entitled, from a quote from one of the Hindu police responding to a Muslim woman, hysterical on the phone, "Come help us," and his response, "We have no orders to save you." This was the title of the Human Rights. Well, Modi was banned from the United States because he did nothing to do this. Now, back to President Obama. This was a terrific speech.
It was an excellent speech.
And, you know, I like speeches. I like policy action more than I like words, but speeches are not nothing. And so continue that. Finish your story.
He talked about Article 25, Section 1 in the Indian Constitution, which states that all men have the right to profess, practice, and propagate the religion of their choice. And President Obama mentioned this. But since 1950 in India, since this was framed, there has been, the Hindu nationalists have wanted to, well, they wanted to get rid of the word propagate, but then they started working towards, well, actually, we should restrict conversion to people under 18. That was quashed by President Mukherjee. And then in
Not permit conversion for anyone below 18.
Below 18. And then in 1965, they wanted to, they brought this up again and said we should prevent conversion for minors. And of course, Jawaharlal Nehru quashed that. In 1967, the state of Orissa passed what was called the Freedom of Religion Act, and then in 1968, Madhya Pradesh passed it. In 1977, the Supreme Court upheld the act. The Freedom of Religion Act basically says what Bob mentioned earlier. In order to convert, you have to have a 30-day, you have to have magistrate's affidavit, you have to prove that you went being coerced, and we're talking about Dalits and really people who are illiterate and uneducated, who wouldn't really feel comfortable going to a court to get an affidavit to say. So this was, many people saw it as the state's way of colluding with Hinduism. One Christian barrister said it's actually a way, it gives basically the Freedom of Religion Act gives a person the right, grants a person the right to express his beliefs, but not convince others.
Mm. All right, well, we want to bring our audience in on this now. We have two excellent Georgetown students. I see one excellent student. Where's the other? There he is, with microphones. And so please state your name, any affiliation you care to give, and direct your question to our panelists.
Hi, I'm Chuck Stetson. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Institute for the Study of Religion at Baylor, and also a venture capitalist. This is a little bit of a related thing, but it's a lot of stuff that's going on both here in the U.S. and in particularly Southeast Asia. We have a program which teaches the Bible in public schools. And if you were proselytizing, you certainly couldn't do that because the U.S. Supreme Court has said you cannot do it. But you can teach it academically, and we're the only First Amendment safe program. We've had 8 states pass legislation based on our research, 7 of which encourage, one of which, state of Texas, mandates the teaching of the Bible in their public schools. And now we're starting to go over to, and we have partners in India, Singapore, Australia, Korea, and China. And we're approaching it from an academic point of view. If you teach about, you're safe. And the government, like in China, there are 100 universities that teach the Bible. But if you are proselytizing, you're in trouble. But you can go partway there. It's just that you have to be very careful. And even as we do it in the U.S., we've had all of the major groups, including the secularists and the academics, all of the Christians, the Jews, sign on. So there are ways of doing some of this stuff, but obviously this is a proselytization conference, but I'm saying that sort of very closely related. So I want to comment on what you were saying, but I'd be interested in your comments on what I was saying.
Thank you, Chuck. I mean, you know, that sounds like a very American distinction between teaching and proselytizing that has to do with the American jurisprudence of the last couple of hundred, particularly since the end of the segment. But talk about this in your own understanding. Is that a useful distinction between presenting the Bible as an academic subject but not proselytizing, or is such a thing possible? Or say whatever you want to say about it.
The whole thing makes me a little bit nervous, but for multiple reasons. But I don't think that when you teach, well, see, because I don't make this proselytism this distinct thing. I think we're always trying to convince people of particular ideas and other things like that. So it's always a continuum. When you're teaching, when you're writing, when you're arguing, when you get upset at someone, you are always trying to change people. And it's just a continuum in terms of how much force is used. And I always get nervous when governments get involved because there's the compulsion aspect of it. But I don't think that it's like this clear thing of like proselytism versus not. When you're teaching the Bible, you're teaching something about it, which could be some things that you think are positive, which then you think is moving people in a direction, or you could be undermining it and trying to make this, make our people safe from this book or whatever. I mean, you're always teaching something.
Yes. Michael?
I lived in Israel as a child, and the only time I ever actually studied the Bible was when I was in the public school in Beersheba, Israel, and it was mandatory. And there was not an alternative. You were there for Torah training. It was in the public school. It was right after my math lesson, and this was designed for education purposes. But I think I knew at the time, even though I was in grade school, that this was not designed for my literacy. This was actually designed to make me a better Jew. And that's the way it was. And so, I can't speak to how it is that children in Southeast Asia or even in Galveston receive this. But I know as a child in a public school who was taught the Old Testament, we all knew what the reason was. We knew why the state and others were funding this. And it wasn't just the state. You also had private foundations that were also involved in providing the books and things like that.
But what about Bob's point that somebody is always trying to, even in your math class, somebody was trying to convince you that something was true. You say somebody was trying to make you a better Jew. Do you have a problem with that? Was it who that was trying to make you a better Jew?
Well, I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but we also understood that the issue, that there was a goal involved. It wasn't simply, I want to present a set of ideas in a neutral way. I agree with Bob that when we teach, we basically are force-feeding our students. We've carved the agenda in a way that points them in some directions rather than others. But I'm sure Bob does this in his class. We also spend a lot of time exposing them to alternative viewpoints. Exactly. And so, to the extent that there's an academic course on religion that actually tries to take a somewhat neutral stance and think about it in a more academic way, as oftentimes happens in university settings, I think that's fine. The question becomes, though, I can tell you that I wasn't exposed to the teachings of Jesus Christ when I was in Israel.
Yeah, Becky, one point. I want to get one more question, though, so let's...
Well, interestingly enough, when I interview Hindu nationalists and political leaders in India, many of them have been educated in mission schools. And when I was recently interviewing a group of Pentecostal converts in India, and I said to them, well, aren't you scared? You've got the RSS and the VHP's office down the road. And they said, well, they've all been to our Catholic school down the road. They know us. They know the teachings of Jesus. So in a sense, a lot of Indians, for the longest time, were open to going to mission schools, and that has helped, for the most part, sort of solve some of the tensions. But now, I think as nationalist fervor has risen, and I think it's probably mission schools aren't going to save them, but it does help.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to take one last question here. Kent Hill. There you go. He's standing up right next to you. There you go.
Kent Hill, World Vision. I suspect virtually everybody in the room is committed to the liberal arts. And one of our assumptions in the curriculum of the liberal arts, of course, is that the whole point of that education is to expose young people to the vast variety of cultures, et cetera, including our own. So we will do that. If we do it right, we try to do that well. As you put it, competitive, different points of view, but presented accurately. I think what Chuck is talking about in terms of do we stand to gain something as Christians by just having a course that might actually describe accurately what Christians believe? A Christian might very well believe that's not a bad place to start. I used to, when I was at Seattle Pacific University, my first career was as a Russian history professor, and I taught a class in 20th century Marxism. And I brought over from the University of Washington a Marxist who had been my professor at University of Washington in Marxism, because I didn't feel that I had anything at all to fear from that Marxist presenting in as positive way as possible his view. In fact, my students would believe more accurately what they actually believed, and they can compare it with Christian beliefs. So I think actually it's a great place to start. If you are of a particular religious orientation, if you can just get a fair representation, even by somebody else, of what is believed, that can happen. I'll end with this. I know of people in the Soviet Union who were art guides in the Hermitage in Leningrad, various art museums. And of course, they had to teach about the paintings, the great 19th century Russian paintings, which were often on religious themes. So she had to tell the story of what these stories were about, these religious stories, and she'd been raised as an atheist, etc. She eventually converted to Christianity, even despite the fact that she was given the most negative possible presentation of the facts. So just getting the facts out there in any form sometimes, if you're really interested in truth, can do an immense amount of good.
Sometimes the facts, yeah.
Yeah, I can never turn down a testimonial to the liberal arts, which is always struggling on college campuses. So I think that's great, and at least one way in which I think the liberal arts has done an immense service to the education and the erudition of American students is by, in some sense, jogging or disabusing them that there's a truth out there, and that there's an exposure to a variety of viewpoints that they need to actually take seriously. And so if you were to ask me, have I been successful at the end of a semester, I would say, well, are my students unsettled? Are they uncomfortable? If they come out of it a little bit skittered because of what they've heard, then I feel like I've done my job. But
So
part of that
Michael,
also,
sorry, you want to make sure they know there is no truth out there?
I don't want to, no, I don't want to say there's no truth, but that to be skeptical, as many religious thinkers have asked us to do, be skeptical of what the truth is supposed to be as presented to us. And so, in this case, just to sort of, proceed and to sort of pull back on my childhood experience, is that the Jewish way of thinking about Judaism in Israel is not coming from a competition of ideas. Israel actually is closer to Egypt in terms of religious freedom than it is to the United States. And why? Because the Orthodox community has a stranglehold over religious education in Israel. So as someone who is growing up Reform or conservative, you're not going to be exposed to that kind of interpretation of Judaism in Israel. And so in the same way when you say the Christian or the Muslim, whenever you say the anything and put the definite article before, I get nervous, because one thing I love about teaching religion to my students is a recognition that there are so many different interpretations that have emerged out there, and sometimes it's the debate within a religious community that I think is actually much more interesting than the debate between.
All right. Well, on the principle, leave them angry and not confused, but in disagreement. Let's, if I could ask, I'm sorry, sir, you'll have an opportunity probably to ask the next panel the same thing. We just need to wrap it up now to keep it moving. We're going to take a 15-minute break, but before we do, would you please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific panel.